The sun beat down hard on the dusty main street of Silver Ridge, the kind of heat that made smart folks stay indoors. But Eliza Morgan wasn't looking for comfort as she rode into town on her tired brown mare. Her old leather boots were cracked from miles of hard travel, and her plain cotton dress had seen better days. Most folks would have just seen another poor drifter passing through, but Eliza wasn't just anybody. She pulled her hat lower, a habit she'd picked up years ago. The scar that ran down the right side of her face from temple to lip had a way of making people stare. Some looked with pity, others with fear or disgust. Over time, she'd learned to keep her head down and speak only when needed. "Whoa, girl," she whispered to her horse as they stopped in front of the town's only saloon. The wooden sign hanging. Above the door read "Silver Dollar" in faded paint. Eliza patted the mare's neck and took a deep breath before climbing down. Her legs were stiff from riding since dawn. A group of men on the porch fell quiet as she tied her horse to the post. One of them spit tobacco juice into the dirt near her boots. "Something we can help you with, miss?" His tone made it clear help wasn't what he was offering. "Just passing through," Eliza said, her voice low but steady. She'd dealt with men like him before. "Looking for work and a place to stay." The man laughed, showing yellow teeth. "Ain't much work for women around here, 'cept at Ruby's place down the street." The other men chuckled. Eliza ignored them and walked into the saloon. The cool shade inside was a welcome relief from the hot sun. A few early drinkers looked up when she entered, then quickly went back to their glasses. The bartender, a heavy-set man with thick arms and a bushy mustache, watched her approach. "Water for me and grain for my horse outside," she said, placing a coin on the scratched wooden bar. The bartender nodded, sliding her the water without a word. He seemed to understand she wasn't there for trouble. "Know where I might find honest work around here?" Eliza asked after taking a long drink. "Mrs. Wilson at the boarding house might need help. 2 doors down from the general store." He pointed in the direction. "Or try the ranch outside town. They're always short-handed." Eliza thanked him with a nod. As she sipped her water, she listened to the talk around her. Most of it was the usual small-town gossip until she heard a name that made her grip her glass tighter. "Walsh is bringing in more men next week. Says he's expanding the north property." Walsh. Harrison Walsh. The name burned in her mind like a hot iron. The man who had murdered her father and stolen everything that belonged to her family. 10 years ago, her father, James Morgan, had been the biggest cattle baron in 3 counties. The Morgan Ranch stretched farther than a man could ride in a day. There were silver mines in the hills and plans for the railroad to come through their land. James Morgan had built an empire from nothing, and his business partner Harrison Walsh had killed him for it. Eliza had been just 17 when she found her father dead in his study. Walsh claimed it was robbers, but she'd seen him leaving the house that night, his hands covered in blood. When she tried to tell the sheriff, Walsh's cousin, no one believed her. Instead, they called her crazy with grief. That same night, Walsh's men had come for her. The scar on her face was their doing. She'd escaped by jumping from her bedroom window and riding away on her father's fastest horse, taking only his gold pocket watch and the land deed her father had always kept in his desk, the one that proved half the Morgan Empire belonged to his only child. Now, after 10 years of moving from town to town, learning to survive on her own, she'd finally come back. Not as Eliza Morgan, the frightened girl who ran away, but as Eliza Smith, a stranger nobody would look at twice. She wasn't here to claim what was hers. Not yet. First, she needed to understand what had become of her father's legacy and gather proof against the man who'd stolen it. "The boarding house still got rooms?" she asked the bartender as she finished her water. "Last I heard. Ask for Mrs. Wilson. Tell her Joe sent you." Eliza nodded her thanks. Outside, she untied her mare and led her down the busy main street. Silver Ridge had grown since she'd last seen it. New buildings lined the street, and the bank had a fresh coat of paint. Signs of money and progress were everywhere. The boarding house was a 2-story building with white curtains in the windows and flower boxes filled with bright blooms despite the dry heat. Mrs. Wilson turned out to be a plump woman with kind eyes who didn't ask too many questions. She showed Eliza to a small room upstairs with a narrow bed, a dresser with a cracked mirror, and a window overlooking the back garden. Breakfast at 6, dinner at 5, Mrs. Wilson said. No men in the rooms, and no coming in after 10. I understand, Eliza said, handing over half her remaining money for the first week's stay. When she was alone, Eliza finally let herself breathe. She hung her hat on the bedpost and looked at her reflection in the mirror. The scar was still angry and red against her sun-darkened skin. Her dark hair hung in a simple braid down her back, and her eyes looked older than her 27 years. Carefully, she removed her father's pocket watch from her boot, where she kept it hidden. Then she checked that the door was locked before taking out her sewing kit. With practiced fingers, she cut open a small section of her coat's lining and pulled out a folded piece of paper. The deed to half of everything Walsh now claimed as his own. I'm home, Pa, she whispered, touching the watch, and I'm going to set things right. As the sun set over Silver Ridge, casting long shadows across her small room, Eliza began planning her next move. Tomorrow she would start watching the town and its people, especially Harrison Walsh. She would find his weaknesses and learn who might stand with her when the time came to reveal the truth. For 2 weeks, Eliza settled into the quiet rhythm of Silver Ridge. She found work at the general store, stacking shelves and keeping accounts for old Mr. Parker, who was losing his eyesight but wouldn't admit it. The job wasn't much, but it gave her a good view of town life and who came and went. Each evening she'd write down what she learned in a small notebook hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her room. Harrison Walsh now owned the biggest house in town, had 4 men who followed him everywhere and visited the bank every Tuesday like clockwork. He'd grown fat and prosperous on her father's land. One sunny morning, Eliza's mare began limping badly as she rode to work. She turned toward the livery stable at the edge of town, hoping someone there could help. Whoa, easy girl, she murmured, guiding the horse through the wide stable doors. The smell of hay and leather filled the cool, shadowy space. A tall man with broad shoulders was brushing down a chestnut stallion in the far stall. He turned at the sound of her entry. Morning, he called, setting down his brush. Something wrong with your horse? She's favoring her front leg, Eliza said, keeping her face turned slightly away out of habit. The man approached, his eyes on the mare rather than Eliza. He ran his hands gently down the horse's leg, checking for heat or swelling. I'm Luke Dawson, he said without looking up. I work at the Walsh Ranch, but I help out here sometimes. Eliza tensed at the mention of Walsh. Eliza Smith, she replied, using the false name she'd chosen. Just passing through. Luke nodded, still focused on her horse. She's picked up a stone bruise, caught it early so she should heal up fine, but she'll need rest for a few days. He finally looked up at Eliza, and unlike most people, his eyes didn't dart away from her scar or stare at it too long. He just met her gaze steadily as if seeing the whole person. I can keep her here and tend to her, he offered. No charge. Eliza shook her head. I can pay. Didn't say you couldn't. Luke smiled, and the warmth of it reached his eyes. Just saying you don't have to. There was something refreshing about his straightforward manner. No pity in his eyes, no awkward politeness, just a man offering help to a stranger. Thank you, she said finally, but I'll stop by to check on her. Suit yourself. I'm usually here mornings before heading to the ranch. Over the next few days, Eliza found herself looking forward to her morning visits to the stable. Luke was always there, already working. He had a way with horses that spoke of patience and understanding. His hands, rough from years of ranch work, moved with surprising gentleness when tending to her mare's injured hoof. You've been doing this a long time, she observed one morning as he applied a poultice to the horse's leg. Since I was tall enough to reach a stirrup, he said with a chuckle. My pa was a horse trainer before he passed, taught me everything I know. Bit by bit, their conversations grew longer. Luke told her about growing up on a small farm that had been swallowed up by the big ranches, how he'd worked his way up from stable boy to ranch hand to foreman through sheer determination. Someday I'll have my own place, he said, looking out the stable door toward the distant mountains. Nothing fancy, just good land and good horses. Eliza found herself sharing small pieces of her own past, too. How she'd traveled from town to town, the odd jobs she'd taken to survive, the sunsets she'd seen from lonely trails. Never anything about her father or Silveridge, but more than she'd told anyone in years. Luke didn't press for details she didn't offer. It was as if he understood that some stories weren't meant to be shared. One morning, Eliza arrived to find her mare standing easily on all four legs, the limp gone. "Looks like she's ready to carry you wherever you're headed next," Luke said, a question in his voice. Eliza stroked the mare's nose. "I think we'll stay in Silveridge a while longer." The smile that lit up Luke's face made something flutter in her chest, a feeling she hadn't experienced in a very long time. As spring warmed the valley, Eliza found more reasons to visit the stable. Sometimes she brought Luke a sandwich from the bakery or coffee in a thermos. He'd stop his work and they'd sit on hay bales talking about nothing important while the horses shuffled in their stalls. She learned that Luke worked for Walsh Ranch, the very land that should have been hers. The irony wasn't lost on her. Every time he mentioned the boss, her stomach knotted with anger. But Luke himself was nothing like Walsh. He spoke of treating the land and animals with respect, of fair wages for honest work. "Walsh works his men too hard and his horses harder," Luke confided one day, his voice low. "But jobs ain't easy to come by around here. He owns nearly everything worth having." "Everything worth having," Eliza repeated softly, thinking of her father. One clear evening as Eliza was leaving the stable, Luke walked her to the road. "There's a dance at the town hall Saturday night," he said, suddenly looking boyish despite his tall frame. "Nothing fancy, just music and some punch, maybe some pie if Mrs. Wilson is feeling generous." He scuffed his boot in the dirt. "Would you like to go? With me, I mean." Eliza's first instinct was to refuse. Getting closer to anyone meant risking her secret. And yet, something in his honest eyes made her hesitate. "I'm not much for dancing," she said. "Neither am I," Luke admitted, with a grin. "My feet are better with stirrups than dance floors. But the music's nice and the company would be better with you there." Eliza thought of her father's watch hidden in her room, of the land deed that could change everything. Attachment was a luxury she couldn't afford. Not now, not until justice was done. And yet she heard herself say, "Yes, I'd like that." The smile that spread across Luke's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. As she walked back to the boarding house, Eliza tried to ignore the warm feeling spreading through her chest. She had come to Silveridge for justice, not love. One dance wouldn't change that. But as she lay in bed that night, she found herself thinking more about Luke's smile than about Harrison Walsh's crimes. And for the first time in 10 years, she fell asleep without dreams of revenge. The town hall had been decorated with paper streamers and wildflowers for the spring dance. Oil lamps cast a warm glow over the wooden floor where couples moved to, the music of a small band. Eliza stood in the doorway, suddenly unsure. She'd spent an hour getting ready, borrowing a blue dress from Mrs. Wilson and pinning her hair up for the first time in years. "You came." Luke's voice behind her made her turn. He looked different out of his work clothes, in a clean white shirt and dark vest. His hair was combed back, still damp from washing. "I said I would," Eliza replied, fighting the urge to turn her scarred side away from him. Luke offered his arm. "You look real nice," he said simply. They stood awkwardly near the punch table at first, watching others dance. The sheriff was there, with his wife, and Eliza recognized Mr. Parker from the store swinging a plump woman around with surprising energy for his age. Several people glanced their way, curious about the scarred newcomer and her companion. "Don't mind them," Luke said, noticing her discomfort. "Small towns run on gossip. They'll find something new to talk about tomorrow." When the band started, a slower tune, Luke held out his hand. "Might as well give them something worth talking about." His hand was warm and steady as he led her onto the floor. True to his word, Luke wasn't much of a dancer, but he moved with the same quiet confidence. He showed with horses. Eliza found herself relaxing as they swayed to the music. "Where'd you learn to dance?" he asked. "My father taught me," she answered without thinking. "Before?" She stopped herself. "Before what?" "Before everything changed," she said quietly. Luke seemed to understand she didn't want to say more. Instead, he told her stories about the people around them. How old Mr. Baker had once won a pie-eating contest by hiding half his pies under the table. How the fiddle player had courted his wife by playing outside her window every night for a month. By the time they stepped outside for air, Eliza was laughing more than she had in years. The night was clear, stars scattered across the sky like diamond dust. They walked to a bench under an old oak tree, far enough from the hall that the music became a distant backdrop to the night sounds. "Thank you for coming with me tonight," Luke said. "Thank you for asking." Their conversation flowed easily about simple things, favorite seasons, foods they liked, places they'd seen. When Luke's hand found hers in the darkness, Eliza didn't pull away. As spring turned to early summer, they spent more time together. On Sundays after church, they'd ride into the hills, Luke on a horse borrowed from the livery stable. He showed her hidden valleys where wildflowers bloomed in blue and yellow carpets, and clear streams where trout darted like silver arrows. During these rides, Eliza learned more about what had happened to her father's land. Walsh had pushed out small ranchers, blocked their water access, hired men with guns to intimidate anyone who stood against him. The sheriff looked the other way, his pockets lined with Walsh's money. "It ain't right," Luke said one afternoon, as they sat by a stream. "My pa's farm used to be just over that ridge. Walsh wanted it for the water rights. When Pa refused to sell, Walsh's men stampeded cattle through our crops 3 years running. Finally broke him." Eliza's hands tightened into fists. "What happened to your father?" "Died the winter after we lost the farm. His heart gave out, but it was really Walsh that killed him." Luke's jaw tightened. "I took work at Walsh's ranch because it was the only job around. Sometimes I think about burning it all down." "That wouldn't change anything," Eliza said, though. She'd had the same thoughts. "Walsh would just rebuild. Men like him always do. You sound like you've known men like him before." Eliza looked away. "I've seen their kind in other towns." That evening, as Luke rode her back to the boarding house, they saw a group of men outside the saloon. One of them was tall and heavy-set, with an expensive hat and a gold watch chain across. "His vest." "That's him," Luke said quietly. "Harrison Walsh." Eliza felt her blood run cold. Even after 10 years, she recognized the man who had murdered her father. He'd grown heavier, his hair now streaked with gray, but the cruel mouth and cold eyes were the same. As if feeling her gaze, Walsh looked up. For a moment, their eyes met across the dusty street. A flicker of something, confusion, then alarm, crossed his face before Eliza turned away. "You all right?" Luke asked. "You've gone pale." "Just tired," she lied. But inside, her heart hammered. Had Walsh recognized her? She'd been just a girl when she fled, but the scar was distinctive. She would need to be more careful. That night, Eliza couldn't sleep. She took out her father's pocket watch, running her thumb over the engraved initials. She'd been in Silveridge nearly 3 months now. She had learned much about Walsh's operations, but still had no proof he had murdered her father. And now, there was Luke to consider. Each day she found herself caring more for him, looking forward to his smile, the sound of his voice, the way his eyes crinkled when he laughed. But getting closer to him meant risking everything. How would he look at her if he knew she'd been lying all this time? The next morning brought troubling news. A farmer named Thomas Brown had stood up to Walsh at a town meeting, protesting Walsh's plan to dam the creek that ran through his property. "Walsh wants to divert all the water to his new cattle operation," Luke told her as they walked toward the stable. "It would dry up half the small farms in the valley." 3 days later, Brown's barn burned to the ground. No one could prove Walsh was behind it, but everyone knew. "This has to stop," Luke said, his voice hard with anger. "Someone needs to stand up to him." "Not you." Eliza said, suddenly afraid. You can't fight him alone. But Luke had already made up his mind. At the next town meeting, he spoke out against the dam project, naming Walsh directly. This land belongs to all of us, he said, looking around at the gathered farmers, not just to the man with the most money. Eliza watched from the back of the room, pride and fear battling in her heart. Luke stood tall, his words simple but powerful. Several other ranchers nodded in agreement. Walsh listened with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. When the meeting ended, he approached Luke, clapping him on the shoulder like an old friend while his men formed a circle around them. You work for me, boy. Don't forget that, Walsh said, loud enough for Eliza to hear. Not anymore, Luke replied, removing Walsh's hand from his shoulder. I quit. As Luke walked away, Walsh's smile disappeared. You'll regret this, he called after him. Nobody crosses me in my own town. Later that night, as they sat on the porch of the boarding house, Eliza took Luke's hand. You were brave today, she said, but Walsh is dangerous. Some things are worth the risk, Luke replied, looking into her eyes. And Eliza knew he wasn't just talking about standing up to Walsh. 2 nights after Luke quit his job at the Walsh Ranch, Eliza was walking back to the boarding house from the general store when she heard sounds of a struggle in the alley behind the saloon. She peered around the corner and her heart stopped. 3 men surrounded Luke, who was already on the ground, blood streaming from a cut above his eye. Boss says to teach you some respect, one man growled, pulling back his boot for another kick. Without thinking, Eliza grabbed a broken piece of wood leaning against the wall and rushed forward. Leave him alone, she shouted, swinging the makeshift weapon at the nearest attacker. The men turned, surprised by her sudden appearance. The distraction gave Luke enough time to trip one of them, sending him sprawling in the dirt. The other 2 hesitated, then backed away. This ain't over, one called as they retreated. Walsh, don't forget. Eliza dropped to her knees beside Luke. His face was badly bruised, and he held his ribs as he tried to sit up. Don't move, she said, gently touching his face. We need to get you to the doctor. No doctor, Luke mumbled. Just help me up. With Eliza's support, Luke limped to her boarding house. Mrs. Wilson took one look at him and ushered them inside without questions, bringing clean water and bandages. In Eliza's small room, she helped him onto the bed and began cleaning his wounds. You shouldn't have gotten involved, Luke said, wincing as she dabbed at the cut over his eye. Those men are dangerous. So am I when I'm angry, Eliza replied, trying to keep her voice steady though her hands shook. Seeing Luke hurt had awakened something fierce inside her. Walsh won't get away with this. Been getting away with worse for years, Luke said bitterly. That's how it works when a man owns half the state. Eliza's hand stilled. Not half the state, she said quietly. Not legally, anyway. Luke looked at her, confused. What do you mean? Eliza took a deep breath. The moment she'd been avoiding for months had arrived. She went to the loose floorboard under her bed and removed her father's watch and the folded document. My real name isn't Eliza Smith, she said, sitting beside him on the bed. It's Eliza Morgan. Luke's eyes widened. Morgan? Like James Morgan, the cattle baron. She unfolded the yellowed paper with its official seals. My father. She told him everything. About finding her father murdered. About Walsh's men giving her the scar when she tried to escape. About fleeing with only the watch and the deed that proved her inheritance. All this land, the ranch where you worked, the mines, the railroad contracts, half of it belongs to me. She finished. Walsh murdered my father for it, and I came back to prove it and take what's mine. Luke was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Say something, Eliza whispered finally. All this time, he said slowly, you were just getting close to me because I worked for Walsh. To get information. No. Eliza reached for his hand, but he pulled away. That's not true. When we met, I didn't know who you were. Everything between us, it's real, Luke. The only lie was my name. He stood up, wincing with pain. How can I believe that? You've been planning this for months while He shook his head. I told you everything about myself. I trusted you. Luke, please, I need some air. He moved toward the door. You're hurt, Eliza protested. At least stay until... I've had worse, he cut her off, not meeting her eyes. Goodbye, Eliza, whoever you are. The door closed behind him, leaving Eliza alone with the watch that had kept her father's time and the paper that proved her claim. She'd finally told her truth, and in doing so might have lost the only person who mattered to her now. The next morning, Eliza made her decision. She'd waited long enough. With the deed in her pocket and her father's watch around her neck, she walked to the town hall where a meeting about the dam project was scheduled. The room was already full when she arrived. Walsh stood at the front, pointing to a large map of the valley. Luke was there too, standing at the back, his face bruised but his jaw set in determination. He didn't look at Eliza when she entered. The dam will bring prosperity to Silveridge, Walsh was saying. Progress requires sacrifice. You mean our sacrifice, a farmer called out. While you get richer. Walsh's smile didn't reach his eyes. This town exists because of me. Everything you see I built. No. Eliza's voice cut through the murmurs. You stole it. All heads turned as she walked to the front of the room. Walsh's face paled slightly as he recognized her. My name is Eliza Morgan, she announced, her voice steady despite her pounding heart. Daughter of James Morgan, who was murdered by this man 10 years ago. Gasps and whispers filled the room. Walsh's shock quickly turned to anger. This woman is clearly unstable, he said. James Morgan had no children, everyone knows that. He kept me a secret to protect me, Eliza countered, unfolding the deed. But he left me half of everything he owned, including the land you're standing on. She held up the document. This is a legal deed, signed and witnessed, giving me ownership of half the Morgan estate. The estate that Harrison Walsh has been pretending is all his for the past decade. Walsh lunged forward, trying to grab the paper, but Eliza stepped back. The crowd surged forward, curious to see the document. She's lying, Walsh shouted. That paper is a forgery. The county records will show it's genuine, Eliza said. Unless, of course, those records have been tampered with, which wouldn't surprise me coming from a murderer. You have no proof I killed anyone, Walsh snarled. I saw you leave my father's study that night, Eliza replied, touching her scar. Your men gave me this when I tried to escape. They thought they'd killed me too, but I survived to tell the truth. The crowd was turning against Walsh now, years of resentment finding a voice. Several farmers moved to stand beside Eliza. Sheriff, Walsh called out. Arrest this woman for slander. The sheriff hesitated, looking between Walsh and the angry crowd. Before he could decide, the doors burst open and Walsh's men rushed in, guns drawn. Take the Morgan woman, Walsh ordered, and anyone who stands with her. You'll have to take. Me too, Luke said, pushing through the crowd to stand beside Eliza. Despite his injuries, he stood tall, facing Walsh without fear. You're a fool, Dawson, Walsh sneered. Throwing your life away for a woman with a pretty story. Not for her story, Luke replied, taking Eliza's hand. For her. The room erupted in chaos as Walsh gave the signal for his men to move in. In the confusion, shots were fired. Eliza saw one of Walsh's men aim at her, but Luke moved in front of her just as the gun went off. Luke! She screamed as he crumpled to the floor, blood spreading across his shirt. She dropped to her knees beside him, pressing her hands against the wound to stop the bleeding. Through tear-filled eyes, she saw Walsh escaping through the back door, the precious deed clutched in his hand. He had taken it when everyone was distracted by the gunfire. Without that paper, she had no proof of her claim. But in that moment, as Luke's blood seeped between her fingers, Eliza realized that some things mattered more than land or justice. Some things were worth more than half the state. For 3 days and nights, Eliza barely left Luke's bedside. The town doctor had removed the bullet, but fever set in, and for hours Luke tossed and turned, lost in painful dreams. Eliza bathed his forehead with cool cloths and whispered to him through the worst of it. Don't you leave me, she murmured, holding his hand. Not when I've just found you. On the morning of the fourth day, his fever broke. When he finally opened his eyes, the relief that washed over Eliza was so strong she couldn't speak. "You're still here," Luke said, his voice weak but clear. "Where else would I be?" She helped him sip some water. "Walsh took your deed," Luke said, remembering. "Your proof." Eliza nodded. "It doesn't matter now. It's everything you came for." She touched his face gently. "Not everything. Not anymore." As Luke grew stronger, news came that Walsh had left town, supposedly for business in the state capital. Eliza knew he was trying to destroy any record of her father's will and deed, to erase her claim forever. "We need to go after him," Luke said, sitting up in bed despite the pain. "Before he burns every record that proves who you are." Eliza pushed him gently back against the pillows. "You're not going anywhere until you're healed. Then you go. Take the next stage to the capital. I'm not leaving you." Luke took her hand. "I'll be right here when you get back. Some things are worth waiting for." 2 days later, Eliza boarded the stagecoach with her father's pocket watch and a letter from Luke to his cousin who worked at the county records office. The journey took 2 full days over rough roads. The state capital was bigger and noisier than she remembered from her childhood visits with her father. Tall buildings lined the main street, and people rushed about their business without a glance at the scarred woman in simple clothes. Luke's cousin, a thin man named Peter, worked in a dusty office piled with record books and yellowed papers. He listened to Eliza's story with wide eyes. "Walsh was here," he confirmed. "Tried to bribe a clerk to lose some records about the Morgan property. Luckily, the clerk came to me instead." He led Eliza to a large safe in the corner of the office. "We put the original will and property deeds in here for safekeeping. Walsh doesn't know, he thinks they're gone." Eliza's hands trembled as Peter handed her the documents. Her father's will naming her his heir, the original deed to the Morgan lands, and something she hadn't known existed. Her father's journal, detailing his suspicions about Walsh in the weeks before his murder. "There's more," Peter said, lowering his voice. "Walsh has enemies here too. Men he cheated in business deals. They've been gathering evidence against him for years, missing tax payments, bribes, even witness accounts of threats against ranchers who wouldn't sell to him. Enough to arrest him?" Peter nodded. "With your testimony about your father's murder, more than enough." When Eliza returned to Silver Ridge, she didn't come alone. A federal marshal named Taylor rode beside her, along with 2 deputies and Peter, who carried copies of all the evidence against Walsh. They found Luke up and about, moving slowly but determined to greet Eliza when the stage arrived. The warmth in his eyes when he saw her made her heart race faster than any galloping horse. Word spread quickly that Eliza Morgan had returned with the law. Farmers and ranchers who had suffered under Walsh's rule gathered in the town square, eager to share their stories with the marshal. "We need to find Walsh before he hears we're back," Marshal Taylor said. "Any idea where he might be?" "He has a hunting cabin in the hills," Luke suggested. "Sometimes goes there when he wants to avoid people asking questions." A group of riders led by the marshal headed into the hills at dawn. Eliza insisted on going with them, despite Luke's concerns. "This started with my father," she said. "It needs to end with me." "Then I'm coming too," Luke replied. Though still weak, his determination matched her own. They found Walsh's cabin empty, but smoke still rose from the chimney. He hadn't been gone long. Fresh tracks led deeper into the forest toward the old silver mine on Morgan property. "He's running," the marshal said. "Probably has an escape route through the mine tunnels." The sound of a single gunshot echoed through the trees. The riders spurred their horses forward, breaking into a clearing where the mine entrance gaped like an open mouth in the hillside. Walsh stood at the entrance, a torch in one hand, a gun in the other. Behind him, inside the mine, they could see stacks of papers and wooden crates. "That's far enough," Walsh shouted when he saw them. "One more step and I burn it all." Eliza dismounted slowly, holding up her hands to show she carried no weapon. "It's over, Walsh," she called. "The marshal has copies of everything. Burning those papers won't change anything. They'll never prove I killed your father, Walsh sneered. No witnesses left alive. Except me, Eliza replied. I saw you leave his study that night. I heard you argue about the property, and I have his journal where he wrote about your threats. Walsh's face twisted with anger. You should have died with him. He raised his gun and fired, but his hand shook, and the bullet whizzed past Eliza's head. Before he could fire again, Luke tackled him from the side, sending them both crashing to the ground. The torch fell into dry leaves, starting a small fire that quickly spread toward the mine entrance. Walsh struggled free and ran into the mine, desperate to escape through the back tunnels. Luke started after him, but Eliza grabbed his arm. Let him go, she said. The mine isn't safe. As if to prove her right, a deep rumble came from inside the mountain. Years of poor maintenance had weakened the supports, and the vibration from running feet was enough to trigger a collapse. The ground shook as rocks and dirt began to fall, blocking the entrance. Walsh's scream echoed briefly before being cut off by the roar of falling earth. The marshal's men quickly put out the fire before it could spread to the forest. No one suggested trying to dig Walsh out. Some endings write themselves. A week later, with Walsh declared dead, and the truth about James Morgan's murder finally known, Eliza stood on a hillside overlooking the valley. The land stretched out before her, green and gold in the summer sun. Ranch land, farmland, the silver mines, and the town of Silver Ridge in the distance. It's all yours now, Luke said, standing beside her. Half the state, just like the stories say. Eliza took his hand. No, she said. Not just mine. The next day, Eliza called a meeting in the town hall. Every seat was filled, with people standing along the walls and spilling out the door. She stood at the front, no longer hiding her scar or her name. My father believed land should belong to those who work it and love it, she began. He would be ashamed of what Walsh did with his legacy. I intend to set things right. She unveiled her plan, the Morgan-Dawson Land Trust. The big ranch would be divided into fair parcels for the farmers who had lost their land to Walsh. The silver mines would be reformed with better conditions and fair wages. Water rights would be shared equally through a new irrigation system designed by engineers from the capital. This land doesn't just belong to me, she finished, looking around, at the stunned faces. It belongs to all of us who call it home. Later that evening, as the sun set over what was now their valley, Luke and Eliza sat on the porch of a small cabin they had chosen as their home. It wasn't the grand house where Eliza had grown up, but it had a view of the mountains and room for horses. You could have had it all, Luke said, his arm around her shoulders. Been the richest woman in the territory. Eliza touched the scar on her face, no longer hiding it from the world or herself. I have everything I need, she said, leaning against him. Some things are worth more than land or money. Like what? He asked, smiling because he already knew the answer. Like being seen for who you really are, she replied. Scars and all. As stars appeared in the darkening sky, they talked of building a future together. Not an empire of land and silver, but something far more precious. A life of love and honesty, where no one had to hide their true self or their true heart. And, that Eliza thought as Luke kissed her, was worth more than owning half the state.